Marc PATRY, je travaille au Centre du patrimoine mondial de l'UNESCO à Paris. Ça fait 10 ans que je suis là. Ça fait 10 ans que je m'occupe des sites du patrimoine naturel, surtout en Amérique latine, Caraïbes et Asie-Pacifique. Et lors de mes 10 années là-bas, j'ai eu la chance quand même de développer une bonne impression sur la situation en ce qui concerne nos sites naturels, les défis, les opportunités. Et donc, je suis là, je suppose, en tant que ce genre de background personnel. J'aimerais remercier M. Michelin de m'avoir invité, l'UNESCO. On est heureux d'être là. J'aimerais que vous partagez mes remerciements aussi au président du Conseil général qui a dû partir. Je veux aussi remercier le président du parc naturel régional. Je me promène souvent dans un parc Vallée de la Chevreuse, pas loin de chez nous. Donc, on apprécie vraiment le modèle très intéressant et qu'on connaît assez bien. Donc, je vais probablement surtout parler en anglais, moi, parce qu'on va donner une ambiance un peu internationale au colloque. Donc, je ne sais pas s'il y en a qui ont besoin d'aller chercher des écouteurs ou qui vont supposer me comprendre avec mon accent, vous allez dire américain. Alors voilà. Un des grands plaisirs de travailler en ce qui concerne... Bon, je parle en français maintenant, d'accord. One of the big pleasures to be associated with World Heritage is to always meet very passionate people, who are passionate about conservation. Over the past 10 years, I've met so many heroes of conservation who selflessly devote themselves to causes that are a high order cause. And there's one right here, Julio, who's from Mexico. I've met many of these people, and it's a pleasure, and I'm again surrounded by you today. I've met you last night. I had a very positive feeling of the group of people I was with. This meeting is taking place, this colloque is taking place in the shadows of Puy du Dôme. So as a representative of UNESCO and of the Secretariat of the World Heritage, I was a bit nervous. We can't be here to be seen to be promoting the nomination. This is not transparent and it's not good governance. But so I called him, Mr. Michelin, and he assured me, no, this is not an issue. We're talking about a global question here. So in that sense, my speech today, or my talk today, will focus on global issues. I have a speech, but I'm not reading it. I'm just trying to follow it, and only half of it was printed off this morning, so we'll see how it goes. I think in the course of this meeting, and when we talk about different situations, it will be important for all of us to remember the great diversity of natural heritage sites around the world. We may have a particularly strong experience, personal or professional experience with one site we've worked with closely, or with a region, but we cannot forget that things are so different no matter where we go. I've had the opportunity to work with World Heritage Sites in Indonesia, I was in Tunisia, I was of course, in many sites in Latin America, in the Poland-Belarus border, and every case is distinct. Every situation has its particularities in terms of many factors, but also in terms of communities and local involvement. So that is very important. It's going to be difficult to come up with clear conclusions. This is the way it has to be done. Whatever you do will have to be décliné. We'll have to take into consideration the local realities. I think, for example, I will cite the Everglades National Park in the United States. Jessica, an expert in cultural landscape here, I'm glad to meet you for the first time, is a World Heritage Site that has spent, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars in doing infrastructure work to protect its outstanding universal value. There's tremendous capacity in the United States, for instance, to do works, to work on the site. But we also have natural heritage sites in Madagascar, in Nepal, who have tremendous complex problems, yet very little capacity. So we are dealing with a wide diversity of sites. Once again, I'm saying let's not forget that. Also, in the course of this meeting, it will be important to remember the different kinds of natural heritage sites. I was a bit confused, Yves, and j'ai oublié votre nom. Laurent, when you're showing your natural heritage sites criteria 7, 8, 9, and 10, you had a large number of these are natural sites, but then a smaller number and I'm curious about how you came up with those numbers. As far as I'm concerned, if it meets any of the criteria, 7, 8, 9, or 10, it is a natural heritage site. And we have 222 natural heritage sites, which includes the mixed sites, as far as I read it. So I'm curious to know how you read that. We can talk about it afterwards. But from our perspective, the natural heritage sites are criteria 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then there are cultural landscapes. We must be careful not to mix the two in terms of the operations of the World Heritage Convention. Now, outside of the World Heritage Convention, you can deal with these in any way you like. But in terms of relating it to the functioning and the processes of the World Heritage Convention, there is a major difference between cultural landscapes, which are not natural heritage sites, and the natural heritage sites. So this is, again, something I will ask you to remember in the course of your colloque, so that when you have discussions and you're reaching conclusions, that they're clear and tight conclusions that are applicable in terms of World Heritage processes. You may find that I will probably come across to you as an old school kind of guy. Protecting nature, we have to protect nature. I mean, we've heard a lot about the connection between human and nature, and that's very important, and I will also emphasize that. But based on my experience in the past 10 years, and prior to that, I worked with conservation. I worked in Mexico, I worked in Ecuador. It's always a sad story. It's always a bad news story from my perspective. It's always going back and back. And so as a response, I think now that I'm working in the World Heritage Center, I see the convention as a good tool to try to slow down the erosion of natural heritage on the planet. And so the way I present this might seem to you as a very old school, draw the line, etc. But this is only to remind you of the situation we're facing globally in terms of natural heritage. And so that you temper your enthusiasm for opening everything up to local community involvement or larger community involvement in the name of larger concepts or other concepts. So it's always a balance we have to remember. So, my first slide here. Okay. By the way, this picture here has nobody in it, but it's a site that that works very well with local communities. And Julio can tell you all about it, is Xancan in Mexico. So I had the pleasure of visiting this with Julio a few years ago, and I was very impressed by what was going on. I think, Julio, you were talking about it later on. So I took a picture here to tell you a bit of a story. When I was very lucky, I was 23 or 24, I had a chance to come and work in Provence. I was working for la Chambre d'Agriculture des Bouches-du-Rhône, the Chamber of Agriculture of the Bouches-du-Rhône in Aix-en-Provence. For a summer, it was a very pleasant job. I have very fond memories of this. And the work was to study l'agriculture périurbaine, peri-urban agriculture. What are the factors that keep it alive? And so I was working with a more senior person at the Chamber of Agriculture, and we had the opportunity of driving around the countryside and stopping and talking to farmers. Of course, they would always offer us a little drink of this or that, and it was a very, very pleasant job. And during this time, my colleague, his name was Max Lefebvre, he would always say, Marc, tu vois la nature, elle est tellement belle, la Provence, oh, qu'elle est belle, la Provence. Hein? It's a very beautiful Provence, a beautiful nature, the hills, the pinèdes, etc. And I would say, yes, it is beautiful. I really honestly believe it's a beautiful part of the world. But I was finding myself in conflict because I realized I was thinking, but this is not nature. As a Canadian, I don't see this as nature. This is just beautiful landscapes. Finally, it came to a head. And so these are the kinds of scenes I had in Provence that were beautiful wilderness or nature. And of course, they're also presented in artistic renditions, which are very well done. And there's no denying that these are beautiful places that I want to spend time here. This is Burgundy. This would be more like a cultural landscape. But I was coming from a different perspective. As a Canadian, we have it's a cultural thing, it's a myth, but that's what we grow up with. Wilderness, the nature is undaunted. It's something where people just pass by and they don't leave a mark. So these are the kinds of images that I grew up with. That was a conflict. And it made me realize that, hey, nature is different depending on who you talk to. And in our discussions here, as the presenters before me mentioned, they all said the same thing. It's a very cultural construct, and we have to be aware of that when we talk about what we're talking about. So here we are, a situation where we have different interpretations of nature, and people and nature. Many different interpretations, not only in this room, but globally. We have people from the Philippines and Mexico and Japan, among others. So what are the commonalities here then? What is the solid ground on which we could stand in order to continue our discussions over the next couple of days? We do have to find a solid ground. Now, I'm here from the World Heritage Center, and all I can offer you for solid ground is the common element of the World Heritage Convention. So we can start, or I suggest we start with the World Heritage Convention. If, indeed, the objective of this colloquium is to consider human-nature relationships in World Heritage Sites, in natural World Heritage Sites, then I suggest strongly that you do not forget the foundations of the World Heritage Convention. So I'll be looking at, well, these are some of the issues that apply. The World Heritage Convention, I don't want to waste time on this, but it basically says we have to preserve the values that have been recognized under the convention and pass them on to further generations. So there's an obligation, it's a legal obligation that almost every country on the planet has signed up to and is obligated to do under this mutual agreement of the convention. So I'm going to show you, just quickly, I'll do the same, but very quickly. Now, I took offense to your comment about the butterflies, oh mon Dieu. Have you not been to this site? It is an amazing spectacle. This is amazing when you stand, and there's a river of butterflies flying by you. It is I still have goosebumps today when I think about it. Now, it is not the actual butterfly that is World Heritage, but the phenomena of the migration and the overwintering, which is unique on the planet. And it is it's just a tremendous, tremendous display. So I have to spend a second to go over that. So this is criteria 7, which are phenomena and beauty, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This is a very tricky subject, and there was recently an IUCN document, an IUCN document that came out on how do you define beauty, or criteria 7. We have criteria 8, Earth's history. You'll say this is just a skeleton. What's the big deal? It's a whale. It's probably hundreds of kilometers from the sea. It's an old fossil of a whale. Some more criteria 8. These are the criteria under which the current site up here is being proposed, 8 and 7. And then we have criteria 9. I'm doing this much more superficially than my colleagues did. Criteria 9 sites are vast and expanse spaces where evolutionary processes and ecosystems are basically permitted to go on as if nothing was there, you know? And you can imagine already the conflict we can face with criteria 9 sites and a bit too much of human activity. And then we have, that's another criteria 9 site. This is Les Lagons de la Nouvelle-Calédonie. It's not all of that, but parts of that. And of course, we have our friendly Galapagos iguanas. I worked there for 4 years, so I'm very familiar with them, and our pandas. So the criteria 9 can be biodiversity not only in single species. For instance, we talk about the great apes in Virunga National Park, focusing on that species, but criteria 10 sites can also include an assemblage of diverse species. And Galapagos also falls into that. It's a very diverse endemic species there. So, where does that take me? At this point, we're talking about the relationship between the two. And again, I'm defining this much more narrowly than what I've been hearing this morning. I'm looking at natural heritage sites, criteria 7 to 10, and I'm looking at the role of people there. I have to admit, Monsieur Michelin, Yves, that I was a bit confused in the way the colloque was presented. You know, he talked about untouched nature, but at the same time inhabited natural sites. And for me, it's either one or the other. And perhaps it's not the same here locally in that concept. So I put a picture here of a glass with oil in it, showing that. Do they mix, really? I'm not sure if they can mix so well. Untouched nature. It'll always be touched as soon as we start touching it. So I'm going to show you, the thinking that has been going on at the World Heritage Convention in terms of people in sites, particularly in terms of the inscription process, and a more mechanistic issue here is the whole boundary side of things. This is one of the islands in Galapagos, and you'll see the town of Puerto Llora, and in the circle is all the agricultural lands, and they're all inside the World Heritage Site. We have a town of about 10,000 people. We have extensive farmlands. They're all inside a World Heritage Site. But this site was inscribed in 1978. It was #1 to be inscribed. And it was a 3-page dossier. Those were the good days, eh? 3 pages, and it got inscribed. It shows to you the beginning of the convention, how we have many sites right now like this that have towns inside, people inside, that perhaps it's an artifact of the early days. Because as we went along, and as the advisory bodies became more experienced with these kinds of things, they started insisting on boundaries that reflected more where the outstanding universal value was located. So we got here, we mentioned it earlier today, Ogasawara Islands, which were inscribed fairly recently. And you can see, I hope, the boundary there, which is drawn very meticulously around perhaps all the private land on the island to include only the lands that are not inhabited. And this is we're seeing more of this. By the way, there's a fantastic, if you don't have it, Google Earth overlay of all the natural heritage sites. So you can, in 2 minutes, have these kinds of boundaries on your Google Earth software. So also, we have to demonstrate today that no matter what goes on in a World Heritage Site, the OUV cannot be threatened. So technically speaking, anything can happen in a World Heritage Site. I could put in the middle of Galapagos Islands a huge nuclear power plant and a mine, as long as I can demonstrate to IUCN and the committee that this will not affect at all the outstanding universal value. Of course, that's a hard test to pass. And generally speaking, we cannot pass that test. But there's a continuum from absolutely nothing to mines and nuclear power plants, at which point things get harder to justify. But it's not to say that we cannot have human activities in natural World Heritage Site. Nowhere does it say that. Nowhere. It's completely possible to do that. The committee will have no problems with that as long as you pass that test that it does not affect the OUV. Now, that's a nice test to try to pass. I mean, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of slides right now. I'll do it quickly. I kind of demonstrate, from my perspective, what's going on out there. And that keeps me from sleeping at night. And then we can talk a bit about the relationship between people and World Heritage. So here again, we are at Keoladeo National Park. It's interesting, because we did not talk about this, about our slides before coming here, yet we've chosen many similar examples. I challenge you to find, where is Keoladeo National Park in this slide? Can you find it? Can you guess where it is? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's that green spot in the middle of what is otherwise very intensively and highly populated lands. Now, people have a local knowledge of how to deal with nature, local knowledge of how to manage resources. So that local knowledge, I don't know what they did for outside the Keoladeo National Park, but now the issue is, do we let that same local knowledge into the park? Because as far as, sometimes from my personal perspective, I may not be speaking from the World Heritage Committee official policy here, but sometimes the local knowledge is not that evident on the outside in terms of managing of the resources and maintaining a balance between nature and culture. Of course, there are many factors. You mentioned the factors that, that's forcing people to behave this way, socioeconomic things, poverty, and we run into problems. But that's a situation we find very often. So if we take a little corner there and zoom it, this is what it looks like. Keoladeo, by the way, is an artificial site. It was created by diverting water here. Before, 200 years ago, there was nothing there. This is a fake site, if you want. But because of that, it's become very rich for migratory birds. So I'll show you a few more. Find the World Heritage Site here. Can you find the boundaries of the World Heritage Site? Very clear, right? In fact, the World Heritage Site is a subset of the Sundarbans. These are shared between India and Bangladesh. But we have the same situation where, if you look at the boundaries, we have this. So and these are countries where there's hunger. People are hungry. People need access to food and security. And there's this hard boundary here. And you wonder, if this boundary is not there, if it's not hard, what happens? What happens? Now, it becomes a societal choice. It has to be a societal choice. Because if you ask the locals whether they want to preserve this site, you can be pretty sure they're going to say no, because we need farmland for our kids and our grandkids, to the point where there'll be nothing left. This is a reality out there in the field. So how do you handle that reality? By the way, probably in another 100 years or 200 years, depending how fast the seas rise, this will be gone. So it's probably the biggest reserve left for tigers in the world. This is the biggest population. From what I understand, I may be wrong, but there's plenty of tigers there, so they'll be gone. And it's pretty well certain that they'll be gone shortly. Here's another one. Now you see Iguazu National Park, you can nicely see the boundaries. 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, you would not even be able to find the park in what would have been a completely forested landscape. So of course, there used to be indigenous people here, they've been pushed aside, but the local socioeconomic reality is that, you know, well, let's go and farm that land, let's put some cattle on that land, and get as much as possible as quickly as possible. So in 50 years, it went from complete jungle and forest to very clear boundaries. Now, if someone comes to us, we say, well, we'd like to talk about local communities and access to the resources in that park. You know, we should find some way to find balances. You have to understand my perspective, and I say, I'm pretty skeptical, because the local communities had plenty of time to find balances outside that park boundary. They didn't. And now they see the piles of good wood and good agricultural land they'd like to have access to. So, you know, although I recognize the need to have good relationships with local communities, there is a challenge. Right now, the big challenge for this one is the people living here want a road to go through here to access over here. And it's up to the government. It's right now in the Parliament of Brazil. They're considering changing the law to allow a road through here. In fact, there was a road here, a rough road for a few years. The site was put on the danger list because of that, and the national government decided to close that road. So these are the challenges we're facing. So here's another nice clear boundary showing you the intensive land use immediately outside. You have Windy in Uganda, same kind of issue here. We have gorillas in Windy. So there's a hunger out there for land. There's tremendous hunger for land. It's justifiable hunger. And these boundaries are what's making a difference right now. Sometimes the boundaries don't work. This is in Thailand. In this part of the protected area, the World Heritage Site, you can see it's not very protected. And that's an issue we're talking to the Thai about right now. We're probably going to modify the boundaries. These are all islands, eh? These World Heritage Sites are all islands in a larger landscape that are basically intensively farmed or used for other purposes. Here's another interesting story in Brazil. Chapada dos Veadeiros National Park, originally proposed as a smaller park, but the government passed a decree to enlarge it, much bigger. But, as you can see immediately to the east of the park, very intensive cattle ranching lands. And the cattle ranching lobby in Brazil is very strong. So when the park was enlarged, they were not very happy, and they managed to overturn the decree that created the park. So as a result, we have what is still a World Heritage Site here. But you know, if you look closely, you have inside, you know, quite a bit of cattle ranchers going in there and using the park. You know, it's big money, so that's an issue. So this right now is been removed. It's no longer a protected area in Brazil, and it's a conflict with World Heritage because the World Heritage Convention still recognizes that piece, but the Brazilians have removed it. So you know, they promised to find alternatives to protect a similar amount of land somewhere else to compensate. So we're in those discussions right now. And then there's the old sustainable mining issues we have here. This piece was removed from Silu just 2 years ago to allow for a uranium mine. And here we are in Mount Nimba, which is Guinea and Côte d'Ivoire, which this was done about 10 years ago for an iron mine. One last slide here. This is Sumatra, Bukit Barisan Selatan. I had the pleasure of being there. And of course, tremendous pressure for coffee growers, rubber growers, and they're climbing into this blue line is the boundary of the park, and they're completely entering these places all around. The population pressures are enormous. And I was looking for a picture. You know that picture of the little boy in the Netherlands who's got his finger in the dam? I feel there's a bit of this going on here. So here are a couple of other sites that have people living in them. And sometimes very, you know, like in Manu right now, there's some indigenous groups, very well established. It's not an issue, not a big problem, but they're starting to use guns there, and they're bringing guns, and they're starting to change their way of living. Their socioeconomic situation is changing. There's a desire to acquire things. And well, how will that affect the site in another 10 or 20 years? We don't know. Currently, it's not such a big deal. It's a big site, but that will change. In Piton's management area, it's mostly privately owned, and there's tourism there. And of course, the tourists, they want to build the operators want to build big hotels. So there's a big conflict right there. In go to conservation area, there's agro-pastoralists in the crater. and there's more and more of them, and they want to have access to that land. Fair enough, they want to have access to that land. That's going to be a conflict. Can you have lions at the same time as the pastoralists? And same thing with Galapagos. Well, we spoke about this before. My speech has run out. So I suppose what I'm telling you here is that from here, I'm in Paris. I live in an ivory tower as well. There's some concepts that are very attractive, and we feel we can apply them very easily in the field. But we get to the field, we realize, oh, c'est un peu plus compliqué. Huh? And I'm not saying it's impossible, but we have to always, I think, keep in mind what the situation is. It could be also related to the fact that, do we consider natural heritage as a heritage, as in this is nice, we want to hand it down to our children, or do we consider it, and this is a dichotomy there, because some people consider it as like a modern Noah's Ark, l'Arche de Noé. Are these the last pieces we're going to keep so that we don't lose the panda, we don't lose the tigers, we don't lose the whatever? Or do we say goodbye to these things as a societal choice because that's life? Huh? So this is becomes more than a question of patrimoine. It becomes a question rather of, I don't know, you are the academics. You can help me with this. So what is the balance between local cultures and conservation? Under the convention, as I was saying earlier, we have clear indicators of conservation. They have to be well defined. The OUV has to be there. We have to have integrity and protection. We do monitoring. There are processes to see that those elements are not lost. And that's good. As I said, it doesn't mean we can't have people interacting, living in the site, but we have ways of measuring whether that's impacting or not. But who defines balance? Who defines that? Maybe the World Heritage Committee does, with support from IUCN and its experts. Who defines local cultures? And that changes a lot, local cultures, right? You said here right here in Auvergne, you have the shepherds, but you also have the ski resorts, the tourism. So who's the local culture? How do you handle this? Who manages the economic and social transformation among local cultures? Things change. I mentioned to you about Manu National Park. Things might change there. These people are not so isolated anymore. Soon they're going to have internet. And what's going to happen then? I'm going to show you the slide because I think this is such a banal slide. We've all seen it 100 times. And I think, what does this mean? It's beautiful, but what does it mean? It's always been the question. How do you transform this into reality? And I think it's more like this. I think it's more like this, where, sustainable development, it's very nice, but there's a big, strong tug of war there. And it's always a question of trying to bring things to a consensus that maintains certain minimum standards on all aspects of environment, economy, and social. And I feel also, in my experience, that every time we talk about sustainable development, it's mostly development, right? And we have, I must say, very high-level members of the, very high-level people. These are states parties at the World Heritage Convention. At the committee meetings, are saying, sustainable mining in World Heritage sites, we should permit that. Okay, let's permit sustainable mining in World Heritage sites. Then what's the difference? What's the difference between a World Heritage site and elsewhere? Coming at it from the purely wilderness perspective, perhaps, I think without clear criteria and enforceable limits, sustainable development runs the risk of going down a one-way street that's called extinction. And once you go down that street, there's no going back. So this is the risk we take. It's the risk we take. Let's be aware of that risk. And are we willing to take that risk? If we decide yes, well then let's do it. These are I just quickly this morning put together a list of some of the very critically or already extinct species. The Iberian lynx, mostly lives in the Doñana National Park in Spain, the World Heritage Site. There's only about 200 of these left. That's it. And it's in the World Heritage Site. Now, to what extent do you want to disturb that? It's a societal choice. So, sorry about this. It's very juvenile. It's very juvenile, but I think that's how I see World Heritage. I mean, World Heritage at least provides a bottom line. Okay, this is a bottom line. Let's experiment with different ways of using our World Heritage sites. Let's see if we're going to put mines in there, if you wish. But the bottom line is the OUV maintained? And if you can allow that, then let's move on. So just a couple of slides to close here, to be more positive note, if you wish, because I've been very negative, I think. It's a gloomy story out there. There are some I can always find some positive examples out there, and I'm sure there's a few people in this room who will provide those examples in the next couple of days. But World Heritage draws a lot of attention. It's a very sexy type of thing, and it could be used, and I think you have already used it very much locally, even though you're not inscribed. I won't say yet or at all, but you're not, that decision hasn't been made. I'm sure you've already leveraged. I don't know if you understand the word leverage, mais c'est le levier. Hein? You've used the World Heritage very well to bring people together, to talk about this. You have something very interesting here. So even, God forbid, you don't get inscribed, you will have achieved something fantastic locally. So you have been able to leverage the convention by building support, political support, public support for conservation, for proper management. And I was going to give this example. I should have taken the slide out and put your picture in there, because in the Lake District in England, they're doing the same thing. They've been going at it for, I think, 10 years now. They have not yet been able to get inscribed, but they've also done something very similar around the project of developing a World Heritage Site. They brought a lot of people together and have been able to move some issues forward. So lessons learned, I think it's always important to clearly identify and document your conservation values and indicators for those values, and this was what you've done. And have them legally recognized and protected locally in national, local laws. That's number one. Huh? And celebrate them, engage the public, and build political support. You want to create a robust multi-stakeholder association. I think that's what I'm seeing here. Excellent. 20 sur 20, avec mention, etc. Develop a common vision, implement actions, monitor progress, engage stakeholders. This is basically, it's not nothing new, c'est pas révolutionnaire. Huh? It's, we recognize that a World Heritage Site will have a greater chance of surviving over the years if this has taken place. If not, you'll have problems, and that means more work for me in Paris, and I would rather not have that work. So that's it. Merci beaucoup, un plaisir, et à bientôt.
Yes, okay. Your comment on, you've talked mainly about World Heritage. Geopark is another way of preserving a number of features, mostly geological. Where do you see that in the spectrum of things you've talked about?
Good question. That's a common confusion. Ramsar sites, biosphere reserves, geoparks, World Heritage. What's the difference? I would say geoparks its objective is to highlight and value geological what do you call it, wealth or heritage, while at the same time promoting local sustainable economic development. It focuses very much on local communities' engagement. It's not necessarily about pure conservation, whereas the bottom line for World Heritage is conservation. That's the bottom line. The rest is very desirable and is encouraged, but in the end, demonstrate that the bottom line is there. And geoparks, and I was going to say to Mr. Michelin here that you're lucky because you have a criteria 8 and 7 sites. Generally, they're easier to manage over less problems with the World Heritage Committee. So.
Bernd Paulowitz in situ World Heritage Consulting. I'm more from a cultural background, and that's where I come in. I work a lot with ICOMOS as well, and I'm very thankful. Actually, I've never thought about this tolerance in the nature. Actually, we have the same discussion in culture, and there is within the cultural sites ongoing tolerance for change discussion. Shall we from the beginning allow more tolerance to change the culture side and what stays at the end? So I think there is a very close connection there as well, and that's really very interesting about this. Well, we should preserve everything, and I'm also old school in culture, and we should preserve all the old buildings, and then people come across and say, yes, but if we have nice new architecture that should fit in, and that we are allowed to change that. So that's one. And the second one is, what about mixed sites? There are less and less mixed sites, because that of the management guidelines and so on, I think that hinders actually this coming up of mixed sites. So I think that's a very interesting concept that gets lost at the moment. Everybody's cultural landscape or nature or culture, but the mixed sites, they get a little bit lost.
I think mixed sites is a particular case where you have the site happens by, I consider, by chance, or that you have cultural aspects that are of outstanding universal value, and the natural aspects that are outstanding universal value. But in the end, you have to protect the OUV of both. And and what I've just said for natural sites applies to mixed sites, I would say. I'm sorry, but and mixed sites, I think, tend to be archaeological places in the middle of the forest somewhere. It's not as if you're talking about urban centers, so it's perhaps easier to manage that way.
Merci. Je me demande si aujourd'hui on définirait encore des valeurs universelles. Aujourd'hui, on a peut-être évolué par rapport à la science, par exemple, le rapport science et savoir local. Et la science a la prétention d'être universelle par opposition au savoir local qui n'aurait pas la rigueur. Et on s'aperçoit de plus en plus que, comme Latour l'a dit, par exemple, la science est aussi une science locale et que les savoirs locaux peuvent largement dépasser le point de vue local. Est-ce que les valeurs universelles n'auraient pas intérêt à évoluer vers une façon de voir aussi qu'il y a des valeurs locales?
C'est une question difficile, ça. Je savais que vous alliez me poser une question difficile. Moi, les valeurs locales ont été développées en général suite à des longues périodes de temps multigénérationnelles. Et maintenant, elles se confrontent à des changements, en général, souvent, des changements locaux qui sont forts aussi. Donc, est-ce que les valeurs locales sont bien adaptées à la réalité actuelle avec l'arrivée de l'Internet, les autoroutes, les tourismes massifs et les communautés locales qui ont développé ces valeurs locales? Est-ce qu'elles sont toujours aptes ou appropriées à la situation actuelle? On peut renverser un peu la question. Mais en tant que... Est-ce qu'on doit adapter la valeur universelle exceptionnelle? Pour les sites naturels, je ne vois pas. Je vois pas une possibilité, là. C'est peut-être mon esprit technique scientifique, mais...
So many thanks, Marc, for a lively and frank presentation also. I wanted to ask you now, you're really the representative here from the Secretariat. And you mentioned at some point in your presentation these questions of, well, how do we actually redefine the balance now between local cultures and who defines it and so on. And I was curious to hear from you, someone, being with, I'm sure, a desk full of dossiers and so on, lots of work in the Secretariat, how you feel that normative developments in recent years to really define what sustainable development should be about, introduce rights-based approaches, speak about international standards and other spheres that should also work or be relevant in the case of World Heritage, how that affects your work in the Secretariat. Because there you could say it is defined. There are defined approaches to deal with the culture of indigenous peoples, collective rights and so on. How does that affect? Is it facilitating your work? Is it making it more difficult? How's your experience working with these kind of standards?
So that's a good question. Recently, IUCN and ICOMOS and I guess ICRAM put out a document called Managing World Heritage Sites or Natural. I forget. I have it here. It's basically came out last year. Managing Natural Sites, I believe it is. Anyway, they have a small chapter on the whole issue of communities, in which they also cover these kinds of elements, the ILO, et cetera, and. Well, of course, from my ivory tower, I will say, well, it's up to the national governments to take account of all these things at the moment of preparation of an inscription. Ideally, this has to happen. Currently, the nomination dossier does not have a checklist. Did you do this? Did you do that? Did you consult with these people? Do you have a letter of support? Although more and more, it's flowing in that direction, and I think that's a good thing. As I said, the more you do this ahead of the inscription, the less it'll be a problem afterwards. Now, in cases where this is starting to appear, it does get complicated, for sure. I mean, ultimately, the responsibility is the national government's responsibility. We don't have any authority to go in and do things, but we can certainly, and our trigger is always OUV. If this is affecting OUV, then please, government, let us know how you're dealing with it. And the pressure is put on, and they have to respond in one way or another.
Je voudrais revenir sur la question que Marie Rouet a posée sur valeurs locales universelles enfin valeurs locales et valeurs universelles. Vous avez dit que les valeurs locales changeaient, c'est vrai, sans problème. Est-ce qu'on peut considérer que la valeur universelle est pérenne dans l'histoire? Est-ce qu'avant la découverte de l'Amérique, la valeur universelle était la même que maintenant? Est-ce que ça n'est pas aussi changé dans ses dimensions à la fois religieuses, symboliques, esthétiques, etc. On le voit bien, la manière dont les sociétés européennes voient le paysage, ça a changé. Hein, et ce ne sont plus les mêmes modèles paysagers. On est passé du bucolique à d'autres modèles. Alors, voilà, je voudrais avoir votre avis.
Je dirais seulement que moi, je parle du point de vue de la Convention qui définit valeur universelle exceptionnelle. Est-ce qu'elle peut changer éventuellement? J'imagine que oui. Moi, je parle aussi côté nature, les sites naturels. Oui, mais de l'autre côté, il y a quand même des éléments... Comme j'ai dit, il y a des projets de société, c'est des décisions de société. Est-ce qu'on veut garder le panda, oui ou non? Est-ce que ça vaut la peine, oui ou non? Jusqu'à présent, on a décidé que oui, ça vaut la peine. Mais il se peut que d'ici 50 ans, on décide que non, ça ne vaut plus la peine. Pardon? Je ne mets pas en doute ça. Oui, oui. Donc, plutôt l'évolution de ces valeurs. Et je suppose, hein, je ne peux pas prédire ce qui va se passer à l'avenir, mais la Convention elle a plus de 40 ans maintenant, et elle a résisté ce genre de choses, mais on voit de plus en plus, on se questionne de plus en plus sur cela. On demande aussi au niveau, quand on fait les évaluations des sites, les États partis demandent de plus en plus que ce soit des évaluateurs locaux ou régionaux qui le fassent. Et donc, on se demande pourquoi. Parce que les valeurs locales, etc. Donc, c'est ce genre de dialogue qu'on entend en ce moment. Alors, on va voir où ça va mener.
Oui, je ne suis pas sûre, dans les exemples que vous avez montrés ici, sur les parcs nationaux en milieu très densément peuplé, que les populations soient contre les parcs. Le problème, c'est quelles compensations, quelles indemnités elles reçoivent quand il y a des tigres qui tuent le bétail, quand il y a des éléphants qui détruisent les cultures et autres. Quand on est en France, quand le loup tue une brebis, il y a des compensations énormes qui sont données, enfin énormes, excusez-moi, par rapport à ce qui se passe en Inde. Voilà, c'est très relatif. En tous les cas, il y a des compensations qui sont données. Là, dans de très nombreux cas, les compensations ne sont pas données. Je parle de l'Inde en l'occurrence, mais aussi, j'imagine, dans ces régions. Et ça a un coût, c'est un choix politique, c'est un choix économique, et ça a un coût. Donc oui, peut-être, je ne pense pas que les gens soient opposés à ces parcs, même en milieu très densément peuplé. Mais quel est le coût qu'on est prêt à payer pour que ça puisse se faire? Pour protéger le tigre, alors évidemment le panda c'est plus facile, mais pour protéger le tigre, l'éléphant, le rhinocéros, quel est le coût qu'on est prêt à payer pour ça? À l'échelle globale, puisqu'on veut nous protéger. Alors qu'il y a des dégâts énormes, énormes, énormes qui sont faits autour de ces parcs dans des milieux très densément peuplés.
Je ne sais pas si c'est une question ou un commentaire.
Peut-être juste pour compléter, en fait, c'est là où on voit bien dans le schéma qu'on avait présenté de la pyramide que l'étage intermédiaire entre le local et le global, qui est l'État, est un élément vraiment indissociable et à prendre en compte et à impliquer au-delà de simplement dire je soutiens le dossier, mais d'assumer aussi les conséquences d'une décision politique, qui n'est peut-être pas toujours facile à prendre et à assumer après.
Je reviens sur les valeurs universelles et exceptionnelles. Il faut regarder les critères. Les critères, ils changent avec le temps. Ils ne sont pas figés, c'est des orientations. Alors c'est déjà le cas, en fait. Ils sont déjà changés les dernières 20 ans. Et les orientations, dans ce sens, ils changent. Alors comme les valeurs locales, ils changent, c'est aussi un niveau supérieur, ça change. Et ça n'existe pas une valeur universelle et exceptionnelle, c'est... Pour chaque site, on définit le valeur pour les sites. Alors, et un rapport de critères. Et les critères, ils peuvent changer si on estime, on change. On a beaucoup, par exemple, on inclut en Australie avec la Purachata et des choses comme ça, les indigènes et tout ça, et les croyances, ils sont beaucoup plus inclus qu'au début de la convention où ce n'était pas le cas. Alors, ça change, alors c'est possible.
Thank you, and thank you, Marc, for an excellent presentation. I wanted to come back to your early point in which you advised not to mix up natural site designation and cultural landscape designation, because I think it is a fundamental question as we ponder this landscape and ponder the whole idea of inhabited natural heritage. And we could debate back and forth which designation is more appropriate. And as we get to learn this place better, I hope we'll have that chance. But from your point of view in the World Heritage Center, when you consider both designation but also management. Just briefly, what would be some of the fundamental differences in how one might manage a site that is designated as a World Heritage Cultural Landscape versus designated as a natural site, but inhabited and managed and shaped by people? From a World Heritage point of view, what are the distinctions? Are there?
I don't know. I would have to give this some thought, right, before I just answer from the top of my head, right? But I guess cultural landscapes are, you know, I'm thinking, what are cultural landscapes? The rice, that's a cultural landscape, isn't it? The rice paddies. You have the tequila landscape, if you want, in Mexico. It's the agave landscape, the coffee landscape, the vineyards, you know, so I see them mostly as agricultural landscapes, and the management issues there is how do you keep them going in a changing economy, right? So at one point, perhaps no one wants to work those rice fields anymore because they've got great jobs in the local Silicon Valley. I don't know. And so what do? You abandon it, or do you pay people as jobs to take care of them? And that's a challenge, I think, with cultural landscapes, and perhaps also cultural landscapes are probably have a lot in common with the parcs naturels régionaux as well, in terms of the type of activity you want to see and promote, and the type you want to discourage. Whereas natural sites, and let's talk about criteria 7 and 8 sites, I believe, because the other ones it's much more difficult, and how you manage those. In situations like, you know, should the committee inscribe the local site here? I mean, you seem to have, well, local, from what I understand, they've thought about this quite a bit already. They have issues of you know, the sheep are providing a service by keeping the certain hills clear of growth, which allows you to better observe the volcanoes, right? So that's a local decision. That's fine. I think in terms of the World Heritage Outstanding Universal Value, I would guess if the trees are growing on it or not, it wouldn't be an issue, right? Because the geological formations are still there. It's not the actual thought, being able to see them perfectly, that counts. I think the Mexicans wanted to inscribe the impact crater of 65 million years ago, which there's hardly any evidence above ground, you know, and that's a possibility. So I don't know if I've answered your question there, just throwing some thoughts in the air. Yeah.
Yeah, I just would like to make, Alexandra Cruz is my name, and I just would like to make a last remark to this question with the cultural landscapes. I mean, this is exactly the problem with this category, which is new, and which is on the one hand much easier for the people and for the one who attempt for a nomination, because it's much easier to meet the criteria than for a natural for the pure natural categories. And on the other hand, the people living in these cultural landscapes, at the beginning, they're all afraid. And now you would like to make a museum out of our landscape. And we are against, because then we cannot change anymore. And this is what in the process has to make clear, that it is a process, and that cultural landscapes have been formed by a process, and that they have always been in a process, except from the last category, and of the relict landscapes. And so, what, at least when I'm involved in the discussions, I explain them that this had been a process, and it will be a process. And this is not a criteria for denying, for being denied, for being referred in your nomination process, but it's much more complicated to prove the OUV and to find a story that is going with an OUV in a landscape that is still productive and where still production is going on and shall go on, and where change has been and where change shall be. So.
Bon, merci à Yves, et merci, je veux remercier à tous les autres ici. Le paysage du Puy de Dôme, c'est bien joli ici. Merci pour cette invitation. Et je vais présenter en anglais parce que je pense qu'il serait moins douloureux pour tout le monde, pour moi spécialement. So in English, to continue, it is really an honor to be part of this conference. It's such an important theme, and it's really exciting to be in this beautiful landscape. Let me begin with a simple premise. and that is that managing inhabited natural heritage requires that we recognize the central role of indigenous and local communities in shaping these landscapes and their associated heritage values in the past and in the present. It requires that we support their role in caring for these places. It requires that we balance nature and culture, and that's a big challenge, as we've heard. And as Roger Garde reminded us today, managing inhabited natural sites is being in perpetual motion. But a key question as we step out into this exciting territory, and that's our daughter on a recent hike in the Adirondack Mountains, a key question that we must ask is who takes responsibility for stewardship of these places, whether it's designated as a protected area or as World Heritage, and how do we help and sustain and support these relationships, which are complex and interconnected. So let us consider here that we are talking really about landscapes, however we define that, and that these places are rich in their cultural and natural values, not in spite of, but because of the presence of people. And let us consider this proposition. All landscapes are natural, all landscapes are cultural, all landscapes have histories. However, again, we define that. We can understand landscape as a meeting ground, a place where nature and culture are intertwined, a place that holds the past and the present, as well as tangible and intangible values. And this is expressed in a quote from our colleague Adrian Phillips, who's past chair of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas and active in a global working group on protected landscapes that I chair. But at the same time, this concept is expressed in a different cosmovision visually by a Zuni artist from Arizona in a representation of their Aboriginal lands. And this was produced as a project to reconnect the Zuni community with their cultural landscapes and revive their traditional ecological knowledge. When I first saw this image, I was so struck by how the congruence with this concept of landscape is expressed also in the other more Western statement, but encompassing different periods of time, sustainable use, and especially the intangible and spiritual dimension. And we see the parallels here with the images that Professors Michelin and Riotot shared with us earlier. But these associative dimensions have also been captured by Western artists, and I don't think this is the first time we've seen a painting by Cézanne this morning. He painted Sainte-Victoire apparently 88 times. And also I share with you some images of Mount Fuji from Hokusai. I was recently in Japan lecturing at a university there, and it was just after Mount Fuji had been inscribed on the World Heritage List as a cultural site, partly because of this history with Hokusai and the associations. But as you can imagine, there was much excitement about the designation, and the association with Hokusai's work came up over and over. So here he is capturing the seascape, which we don't want to forget in our discussion of landscape and seascape, maybe not so important here in the Shan de Puy region, but elsewhere. And the associated, the working of man and nature, and the associated biodiversity. So landscapes can be iconic places like Mount Fuji, but they can also be places like Machu Picchu in Peru, a World Heritage Site, and I kind of liked the congruence between those two images. And places, of course, like the Grand Canyon in Arizona. They can be dominated or very present, the cultural features, such as in this case of Banska Štiavnica, a World Heritage Site in Slovakia, or by natural values and cultural features like the Quijos River Valley in Ecuador, not a World Heritage Site, but an interesting landscape. And landscapes, I believe, can be familiar and humble and close to home. This is where we live in Newbury, Massachusetts, in the watershed of the Parker River, and this is a very typical landscape. It's a salt marsh, and it's protected by a local land trust, so it's a private protected area. It was shaped originally by the indigenous peoples of our area and later by the European settlers. And to this day, it is managed in a traditional fashion. The hay, the salt hay, which is good for gardening and farming, is harvested according to traditional practices that are intricately determined by tide and season. And of course, another dimension that I would like to remind us of is the spiritual dimension, sacred natural sites. Landscapes can be these as well. In the case of the Gatune Sacred Natural Site in Kenya, local leaders have been collaborating with NGOs to revive the practices, the rituals, partly for the sake of the youth. They weren't happy with how the young people were behaving in the community, and they felt that reviving the site and its values would have an effect. And it's become more effectively conserved by the communities that have kept its traditional practices. So yesterday I learned that we are near a sacred site right here, that the Puy de Dôme mountain was actually considered a sacred mountain by the early inhabitants of this area. And I can only imagine that the associative value of this sacredness has been important to its past stewardship, but also to how it will be managed in the future. So rich in biocultural diversity, these places are with us today for a reason, and one of those reasons is a long and complex relationship, as mentioned earlier by other speakers, and the care that is provided by the communities who live and work in these places. And I think there's been a bit at the global level, in the protected areas field, a sea change that started a long time ago, but certainly became quite evident after the World Parks Congress in Durban, South Africa in 2003, recognizing more the importance of local communities as partners. And an important part of that has been the emergence of this idea of governance, not just management, which is what to do, but governance, who makes the decisions, and the idea that it's not just protected areas created by governments, but also in arrangements that can include shared governance and community governance. And these areas, these regimes have been growing. And I think it's paralleled with the community as the fifth C. We've heard that mentioned several times today. And it's an important element. And I think that by highlighting the important role of local and indigenous communities in the conservation of World Heritage Sites, the World Heritage Convention has taken a big step. But of course there are challenges. How do you ensure meaningful participation upstream in the process? And again, we saw those recommendations in the presentation by Yves and Laurent. How do you foster really active involvement in conservation at site level? How do you reach the full potential of World Heritage to leverage, as we heard earlier, sustainable development? And a further challenge, I think, and it keeps coming up over and over this morning, is this question of the perceived divide between nature and culture. And this persists. It persists in lots of ways, not only in our worldview, but in how we allocate resources, how we make decisions, how we structure our institutions. So, connected to that challenge is something that a term I've been using already, stewardship. I'm not sure how it's being translated into French. It's one of those words that often is difficult to translate. But here's a working definition: efforts to nurture, enable responsibility in landowners and resource users to manage and protect resources. But really what it's about, what stewardship is about, is responsibility. It's about simply people taking care of places. And that when people care, when they love a place, that comes naturally, I would argue. And these issues face all protected area managers, not just those who are in World Heritage Sites. We heard this already this morning from our colleague from the Regional Natural Heritage Site. But here in the Belize Barrier Reef System, which is World Heritage and which is, I believe, still on the endangered list? Yes. NGOs play a very important role in governance and management, and they face the key challenge of engaging local communities. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes here to just introduce you to a program that I think is doing this very effectively in a number of World Heritage Sites, and I've had the privilege of working with Compact, Community Management of Protected Areas for Conservation, as a consultant for the last 3 years. You're going to be hearing much more about it from our colleague Julio Moret this afternoon, but this is a little bit of an introduction and an overview at global level. You can see that it's in 9 countries, 8 sites, but it is a program, again, with relevance globally. So the sites are in Belize, Dominica, Kenya, Mexico, Philippines, Tanzania, Senegal, Mauritania, and Madagascar. And Compact grew out of a 3-way partnership. The UNESCO World Heritage Center was involved. The implementing agency is the United Nations Development Program, Global Environmental Facilities Small Grants Program, better known as SGP, much easier to say. And then finally, the United Nations Foundation, which provided a very substantial commitment of money to make this happen. And it's continued over 12 years. It started with a 15-year vision, and it's still continuing in many places, and it's expanding to others. And so Compact offers a model that has been rigorously tested in diverse settings. And this is a page from a book that we've just brought out on Compact's 12-year history. There's an example there on the table for display. And if anyone's interested in obtaining a copy, let me know, and we can make that happen. Whoops. And Julio has a wonderful chapter in there on his work in the Siancán Biosphere Reserve, among others. So each of the sites is profiled. And I won't read through all of these objectives in the interest of time, but basically Compact was really responding to some needs related to involving local communities and getting beyond the idea of threats of local communities to protected areas, but rather as partnerships and supporting community-based activities. And finally, sharing these lessons at local and national level and global level so that it can extend to other parts of the world. And that's the phase we're in now. And after this meeting, we're headed to a workshop in Kenya through the African Nature Program of World Heritage with Marc's colleague Guy Debonnet to bring this model or introduce it to some other managers in Africa. And very briefly, the idea was to take advantage of the fact that World Heritage sites can be wonderful learning laboratories and places that are high profile and get a lot of attention. Very briefly, there are three elements in the planning frameworks, and they involve a baseline assessment, providing a snapshot of what's going on the ground, a conceptual model that helps with planning and identifying what are the key threats to the conservation targets, and then a site strategy for how the program moves forward. But it really is a very flexible, though kind of rooted in science, it's very flexible and really allows input at the local level. So while there's a software program called Marathi that maps some of these things, a lot of these planning exercises, again, as Julio will share, are done with sticky boards and in very community-friendly settings, and then translated into this somewhat more analytical approach. And the idea is really, it's been an adaptive management approach, and one that's based on the idea of learning by doing and harnessing synergy at the landscape level, so that programs or grants are clustered into different thematic areas and complemented with capacity building, training, and exchange opportunities. And all of this means that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And again, much more detail on this is available in the book that I've mentioned, but just a quick overview. And it's really something you can't rush, as we know with any kind of engagement with diverse stakeholders or community leaders. These things take time, they take a commitment over time. As a quick example, in Madagascar, Compact's program really targets local communities, and with the aim of promoting community governance of natural resources at local and regional and national levels, supporting sustainable livelihoods, and providing other alternatives to current pressures that threaten the biodiversity of the landscape. And as mentioned again, you'll be hearing next about Compact from Julio later this afternoon. So we recently, as part of this book, we did a quick review of Compact's decade of experience. It's also now being evaluated by an independent evaluator. And here are some of the key observations. One was that one of the principles that is very fundamental to Compact's success was taking a landscape approach, finding constructive ways to work with different communities and stakeholders. Another was this balance of rooting the methodology in science, but in a way that's culturally sensitive, so that while it's guided by an adaptive strategic planning process, it's also flexible, and it can engage local decision makers and leaders, harnessing the power of synergy, as mentioned before, connecting small grants, capacity building, and support with marketing, and then this idea, which you see as well in collaborative management, the principle of sharing power. So, it says a lot for an organization such as the SGP, the Small Grants Program, that they've been able to operate in that way. But I think one strength of the SGP, which is now in 129 countries, is it already had that approach in its core program, and so adapting the compact model was a step, but not a huge step. And what you can see is that compact is scalable. If you start at the level of the protected area and you keep those lessons close to the protected area and look at ways to track progress over time and build outward from the site to different levels, then you can manage this. You can look at this pilot effort and see how it applies in a range of different protected areas and governance sites. And that's certainly been the reaction as people have learned about this program. And it was my own reaction. When I first joined as a consultant, I was supposed to evaluate compact, but I pretty soon became so enamored of the program that I no longer qualified as a good evaluator. So now I've been more involved in helping to bring out the stories and to pass the model along. So some ways that compact might contribute to World Heritage strategy are in areas of promoting community engagement, because compact has really developed some very effective methods and institutions, such as the local consultative body, that are really frameworks for bringing people together. And again, this offers a way to learn from compact's experience at all stages, so that if one of the challenges with the 5th C in World Heritage is not just how do we involve local communities once the place is designated, but rather upstream in the process, because as was mentioned early, I think, and also by Marc, that engaging communities early is a way to really build motivation for the site. Well, compact has some experience that might be translated. Compact sites, because they involve large landscapes, are all about governance, this question of governance, and encompass co-managed private protected areas, as well as ICCAs, or Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas. And so one of the things we've been doing in the last year, we've started kind of reviving a very active discussion with the UNESCO World Heritage Center, is looking at ways that we can strengthen these partnerships with different actors. And so as mentioned before, we're in the process of collaborating with the World Heritage Center on initiatives to extend the compact concept and explore how it could be useful to the World Heritage Strategy. And here's a quote from Kishore Rao, director, or still director of the UNESCO World Heritage Center, about how compact offers a valuable experience in this area. So again, you'll be hearing more about compact, and there's much more information in the book, but I just wanted to give you a quick introduction. And in my last few minutes, as we enter into this conference on managing and habitat natural heritage, I thought back to a conference I was involved in last year that was hosted at Rutgers University about cultural landscapes, and brought together perspectives from all over the world, and many indigenous perspectives as well, but also people from within the US National Park Service, Parks Canada. It was a very academics and practitioners. It was a very interesting mix that came together for this meeting. And one of the things that the organizers did at the end of our discussions was they created something called a word cloud. Has anyone seen these before? They're kind of fun. You look at how often a word appears in the discussion, and this is done by computers, sort of sorting whatever notes have been taken or the work of the rapporteurs, and then the font is adjusted according to its relative value. So you can see in our word cloud how themes like communities and heritage, change, and indigenous perspectives, people, of course, came out so strongly. And perhaps if we were to create a word cloud here, we might see some congruence. And I moderated a session there on communities and traditional landscapes, and I'm just going to read this because I think the points are relevant to our discussions here in Clermont-Ferrand. These were the findings from our group, which again included diverse perspectives and diverse cosmovisions, indigenous as well as more Western. Cultural landscapes, the result of a long and complex relationship between people and nature, are with us today because of the past and present day stewardship of those communities living in and near them. They are places of ingenuity and innovation, of mystery and spiritual power, of learning and healing, of conflict and coexistence, whose complex array of cultural and natural values, tangible as well as intangible, are not readily understood by the outside visitor or manager. Understanding requires honoring the worldviews and core values of the communities that are or were their stewards over different periods, listening to diverse voices and perspectives, and respecting the knowledge systems and practices embedded in these places, which have much to teach us about resilience. We've been talking many times today about this nature-culture split. I think at the global level we are making some progress. We're seeing that in broad trends in conservation of protected areas in an organization perhaps like IUCN, in World Heritage, as well as in the NGO community. And we heard today from Yves and Laurent about how it's also emerging in the academy, this putting together and taking a more integrated approach. But I think the progress is still slow. We still have this separation deeply embedded. And that landscape and seascape, that concept offers us a bridge, because after all landscapes and seascapes have these values. And when we think really in that way, we have to unite nature and culture. There's just no choice. Some new opportunities are emerging, and there are lots of trends we could talk about, but maybe I'll mention just three. And one is this question of the rise of governance. Julio, you may recognize yourself there. And the idea that understanding, and oh wait, actually this was wrong bullet, sorry. The increasing reliance on partnerships and participatory approaches to conservation, which is actually connected to the next point, which is the rise of different governance mechanisms and the understanding that these lead to, that they must all be taken into account: government, collaborative managed, private and indigenous managed areas. And understanding that, I think, is going to lead us to greater flexibility and creativity in conservation planning. And this is especially important in inhabited landscapes, as we heard again from the manager of the regional natural park. Land in such landscapes is under many different uses, different ownership patterns, different regimes, and therefore understanding the diverse array of governance options gives us a way to be more flexible. And this is an article by my husband, Brent Mitchell, who's joined us here, who does a lot of work on private land conservation. And finally, and this has come up a couple times about local knowledge and local know-how, I think was mentioned earlier, but the growing interest in diverse knowledge systems and respect for traditional practices, and the progress that's happening all over to transfer this to the next generation. And in the work I do with the New England Biolabs Foundation, we support a number of projects in that area, and it's very encouraging to see how the younger generation is being introduced. And here in the El Parque de la Papa in Peru, which is a park devoted to the traditional management related to potato cultivation, the young people, these Quechua communities have been involved in participatory video and archiving of some of their agrobiodiversity and the local knowledge of the elders. So again, I think that's very encouraging. So all of this offers big promise, I think, a promise for the big task of fostering stewardship of special places, including and maybe especially those inscribed as World Heritage. But I would say that nothing is more important than love of place. When in the end, whether a place is recognized as special at local or national and global levels, nothing is more important to its future. In the very short time that I've been here, which is about 48 hours, I already have the impression, I hope it's correct, that this love of place is actually present in abundance here. People seem to be so proud of the landscape, of where they live and work, and they speak of it with such enthusiasm. And I think that is the true basis for stewardship. So I look forward to our discussions together in the next few days, and especially to being able to see more of this beautiful landscape. Thank you. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention.
Bien, bonjour à tous et merci à Yves Michelin et Cécile Loli de m'avoir invité à ce colloque. Je me présente très rapidement. Je suis d'origine agronome et géographe, directeur de recherche émérite au CNRS. Donc je suis retraité, mais je travaille toujours. Voilà. Mon nom, LUGINBUHL, est très lié à la question du paysage, puisque ça veut dire « regarde vers la colline ». C'est « look at the hill » en anglais. Voilà, exactement. Donc, Yves m'a demandé de faire un état des lieux, des modalités de gestion des biens inscrits au niveau européen et français. Lourde tâche, puisqu'à partir de l'adoption de la Convention du patrimoine mondial, beaucoup de sites ont été inscrits sur la liste dans l'enthousiasme au début, sans plan de gestion et sans prévision de leur avenir, sans se poser vraiment la question comment préserver la valeur universelle exceptionnelle, comment les acteurs vont pouvoir maintenir ces critères difficiles à définir que sont l'authenticité et l'intégrité, et qui sont essentiels pourtant à l'inscription. Donc on sait qu'il y a eu de grands débats autour de ces termes, authenticité, intégrité. Les orientations qui guident la mise en œuvre de la Convention reviennent dessus, le document de Nara également. Et puis, il y a eu cette prise de conscience de l'insuffisance de la protection et donc de la nécessité de gérer. Mais qu'est-ce que ça signifie, gérer ? Les documents officiels ne définissent pas en général la gestion, la protection ou l'aménagement, sauf la Convention européenne du paysage, dont je suis d'ailleurs un des co-rédacteurs, qui définit des termes comme le paysage, la politique du paysage, les objectifs de qualité paysagère, la protection, la gestion, l'aménagement. Et cette convention a une originalité puisqu'elle porte sur tous les paysages, qu'ils soient remarquables ou qu'ils soient des paysages vécus quotidiennement par leurs habitants. Et ça, je pense que c'est quelque chose qui est une avancée par rapport aux législations qui étaient en cours, notamment en France, par rapport à la loi paysage de 1993, en sachant que protection, gestion et aménagement ne sont pas exclusifs l'un de l'autre, c'est qu'on peut faire les trois en même temps sur le même territoire, gérer, protéger, aménager. Et bien sûr, ceci renvoie à la question, est-ce qu'un bien du patrimoine mondial peut répondre aussi à ces divers objectifs ? Un paysage exceptionnel, culturel ou naturel, est aussi un paysage quotidien, vécu quotidiennement par les habitants. Même s'il n'est pas habité, il y a des gens qui vont dedans, qui vont le visiter, etc. Et donc il est vécu. Donc voilà, c'est la définition de la notion de gestion par la Convention européenne du paysage, comprend les actions visant, dans une perspective de développement durable, à entretenir le paysage afin de guider et d'harmoniser les transformations induites par les évolutions sociales, économiques et environnementales. Mais en même temps, tout territoire, quel qu'il soit, est soumis à des évolutions inéluctables, d'où l'expression qu'on a utilisée de patrimoine vivant. Et ces évolutions résultent des décisions des divers acteurs de modifier leur cadre de vie. On peut dire que si on fait référence à la notion de gouvernance, que chaque acteur, d'une certaine manière, gouverne une petite partie du paysage, quel qu'il soit. C'est-à-dire, à la limite, on pourrait dire que celui qui construit un pavillon, il gouverne une partie du paysage dans lequel est inscrit son pavillon. Et donc, ces décisions, elles sont parfois contradictoires et elles s'exercent à différentes échelles. Donc, gérer un paysage en évolution, c'est articuler des processus qui sont des processus socio-économiques, qui résultent des dynamiques des secteurs d'activité, mais aussi des processus biophysiques qui concernent les dynamiques propres des milieux naturels ou anthropisés. Et c'est dans l'interaction que l'on peut agir, sachant que les premiers processus modifient les seconds et que les seconds modifient par rétroaction les premiers. D'où la complexité de la gestion ou de la gouvernance. Et j'insiste beaucoup sur le fait que complexe, ce n'est pas compliqué, c'est différent. Et là, je renvoie bien sûr à Edgar Morin et à tous ces travaux sur la complexité. Alors, je vais prendre quelques exemples européens, français, mais aussi d'autres pays d'Europe. Alors, le Mont-Saint-Michel, ça a été un des sites inscrits, un des premiers inscrits après l'adoption de la Convention du patrimoine mondial. Et alors, évidemment, on se pose la question, comment peut-on préserver l'authenticité du mont? Sur quelle base historique de référence peut-on se fonder? Est-ce que c'est le Moyen-Âge? Est-ce que c'est le XVIIIe siècle? C'est le XIXe, etc. Sachant que pour la majorité des gens qu'on est amené à interroger dans la baie, je l'ai fait, j'ai interrogé de nombreux habitants et visiteurs de la baie du Mont-Saint-Michel, le mont est intemporel. Il n'y a pas de période de référence. Il est inscrit dans une histoire éternelle. Comme le disent les recommandations pour la mise en œuvre de la Convention, il faut tenir compte du contexte culturel dans lequel s'inscrit le bien. Alors, il se trouve que le Mont-Saint-Michel, il est en Normandie, vous le savez, puisque le Couesnon, le petit fleuve côtier, dans sa folie, a mis le mont en Normandie. Mais il y a aussi la Bretagne. Et donc, ce sont deux contextes différents. Est-ce qu'il faut se fonder sur la culture normande ou la culture bretonne? Est-ce qu'elles sont identiques? Non, elles ne sont pas identiques. Et puis, préserver l'intégrité du mont, comment faire? Sachant qu'il y a une grande diversité de paysages. Ça, c'est une carte un peu rapide, faite à la main d'ailleurs, que j'avais réalisée dans les années 90, avec de nombreux types de paysages, de polders, de bocages, etc., etc. Je ne vais pas trop passer de temps dessus. Et ça, c'est le périmètre UNESCO. Voilà, ici, avec des bandes littorales, et puis la zone tampon. Et puis, tout autour, on a récemment délimité ce qu'on appelle une aire de perception visuelle qui s'appuie sur ce qu'on appelle les montjoies, qui sont les belvédères, les points de vue à partir desquels les pèlerins découvraient le mont. Ça va jusqu'à 43 km. Ici, à Mortain, jusqu'au mont, il y a 43 km. Et on voit le mont. Voilà, par exemple, le point de vue de Mortain. Et vous voyez le mont au fond, pris au téléobjectif. Voilà, bon, j'aurais pu vous en montrer bien d'autres. Et voilà le mont Saint-Michel vu de près, avec ces bâtiments qui sont une alliance de conception médiévale, de la Renaissance, etc., jusqu'au XIXe siècle. Les bocages, voilà un bocage breton, vous voyez, des formes d'arbres émondés, avec toute une série de savoir-faire extrêmement précis de la taille des arbres, qu'on taille à des rythmes réguliers, tous les 7 ans, pour faire du bois de chauffage, pour faire du bois d'œuvre, avec une destination bien précise du bois. Et voilà le bocage normand, qui est très différent, avec d'autres usages, etc. Et évidemment, tous ces paysages sont gérés selon des savoir-faire dits très divers. Alors, la gestion, elle n'est pas celle du mont lui-même, mais elle dépend de nombreux facteurs, notamment de l'évolution des activités dans la baie, en particulier l'agriculture. Il y a aussi l'ensablement de la baie maritime, l'évolution de la végétation des marais maritimes, qu'on appelle les herbus, là où on produit les fameux moutons de présalé, qui sont maintenant une appellation d'origine protégée. Et puis, bien sûr, l'évolution de la fréquentation touristique et bien d'autres facteurs, bien d'autres. Tous interreliés, tous interactifs. D'où cette grande complexité. Et ça, ce sont des extraits d'enquêtes que j'ai donc réalisés. Donc on voit bien que les gens sont à la fois conscients de l'évolution de l'ensablement et de la progression des herbus vers le mont. D'où la grande peur de voir un jour le mont dans la terre, alors qu'il a été inscrit aussi pour son caractère maritime. Et pour ce flux et ce reflux des grandes marées. Alors, qu'est-ce qui se passe sur les herbus? Il y a une plante qui a été introduite à la fin du XIXe siècle pour fixer les polders et les dunes, le chien-dent maritime, qui se répand sur les herbus et qui fait progresser les herbus vers les monts. Et il y a des mottes qui s'installent en bordure maritime des herbus, et on a été sollicité avec des écologues pour travailler sur cette progression, mais on ne savait pas d'où ça venait. Pourquoi, d'un seul coup, le chien dent s'est mis à proliférer et faire avancer les herbus vers le monde. Et donc, on a travaillé avec des écologues et on s'est rendu compte qu'en fait, un des facteurs d'évolution, c'était l'envoi ou le rejet de l'azote par l'agriculture productiviste de la baie, des différents bassins versants de la baie du Mont-Saint-Michel. Ici, on a une carte de l'évolution des haies. Et vous voyez que les haies disparaissent massivement, que c'est une agriculture productiviste qui s'est installée avec de l'élevage hors sol, des porcs, des volailles, etc. etc. Et on a supprimé une grande partie du bocage pour faire de l'agriculture spéculative, et on répand de l'azote dans les champs, parce que les cochons, les vaches, tout ça, ça produit beaucoup de lisier. Quand on ne sait pas quoi en faire, on le répand dans les champs, soi-disant comme engrais, mais on en met beaucoup trop. Et donc ça part dans la baie. Et cet azote permet la fixation du chien-dent maritime sur les herbus. Alors on voit le chien-dent maritime, on le voit bien là, vous voyez ici, il s'est massivement, il a proliféré, voilà la source de l'azote, et ensuite, bien sûr, ça augmente les sédiments dans la baie du Mont-Saint-Michel. Et là, les gens sont très conscients de tout cela, ils savent très bien que l'agriculture a évolué, il y en a qui critiquent, effectivement, vous voyez, oui, maintenant, ce qui compte, c'est la rentabilité, on ne s'occupe plus de la beauté du paysage, on s'occupe de la rentabilité. Le maïs, c'est pas beau, ça ne fait pas partie du coin, ça, etc., etc. Et donc, on s'est posé la question, qui est-ce qui gouverne cette baie du Mont-Saint-Michel? Chacun, chaque acteur, à son échelle, gouverne une partie plus ou moins étendue. Et comment donc concilier ces différentes aspirations, ces différents objectifs sociaux, qui relèvent un peu de tout, y compris de celui qui va construire ici ce pavillon extraordinaire avec sa haie en forme d'obus, vestige de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, vous voyez, cette mémoire sociale. Et voilà, les gens s'expriment et on voit bien que, vous voyez, cette perception, la représentation que les gens se font du Mont-Saint-Michel, ça fait penser au Moyen-Âge, etc. Et puis maintenant, tout est fait made in Taiwan, etc., au Mont-Saint-Michel. Bon, les gens critiquent en même temps cette gestion touristique. Il y a 3,5 millions de touristes au Mont-Saint-Michel chaque année. Donc, vous voyez, voilà, toutes ces enseignes, les parkings pour aller visiter le mont. Voilà le parking tel qu'il était. On va voir qu'il a été modifié maintenant. Voilà les restaurants. Voilà, c'est un monument à pognon. Moi, ça m'ennuie. C'est business, le Mont-Saint-Michel. Voilà. Voilà. Alors ça, c'est l'authenticité de la baie du Mont-Saint-Michel. L'alligator, c'est bien connu. Voilà. Alors, donc on s'est posé la question avec les services de l'administration, le ministère de l'écologie et le ministère de la culture, comment faire pour gérer ce bien, ce grand paysage. Alors c'est là où on a réussi à imposer l'ère de perception visuelle. Mais la gouvernance, elle est liée bien sûr à cette diversité d'acteurs, à ces grandes catégories, ces très nombreuses catégories, chasseurs, pêcheurs, agriculteurs, mytiliculteurs, qui ne s'entendent pas avec les agriculteurs, parce que les agriculteurs envoient des bactéries fécales dans la baie et que ça pollue les moules, donc il faut laver les moules, ça coûte plus cher. Et entre mytiliculteurs, on ne s'entend pas parce qu'il y a plusieurs groupes, etc., etc. C'est très compliqué. Et il y a, comme vous le voyez, 2 régions, 2 départements, etc., etc., de très nombreuses communes qui sont concernées. Bon, ça, c'était un premier exemple. Je vais prendre un autre exemple, Cinque Terre, en Italie, qui a été inscrit en 1997, dont la gestion est confiée au Parco Nazionale delle Cinque Terre, avec un enjeu fondamental qui est de maintenir les terrasses viticoles abandonnées et envahies par la végétation spontanée. et puis contenir les flux touristiques, parce que vous savez peut-être que Cinque Terre fait partie, voilà, ce extraordinaire paysage de terrasses qui tombe dans la Méditerranée. Donc Cinque Terre fait partie des sites recommandés aux États-Unis parce que c'est un lieu où il n'y a pas de terrorisme. Et on peut être tranquille, quoi. Alors, il y a de très nombreux touristes qui arrivent. Alors voilà la végétation qui envahit les terrasses, vous voyez, les terrasses disparaissent. Hein, et il y a une population d'agriculteurs qui diminue terriblement, hein, de viticulteurs, alors qu'il faudrait pouvoir maintenir toutes ces terrasses. Donc c'est un énorme problème de gestion, avec des difficultés d'accès. C'est peut-être un atout pour contenir les flux touristiques, hein, qui arrivent en général par le train, puisqu'il y a une ligne, la grande ligne qui longe la côte, qui passe par des tunnels et qui irrigue toutes les petites localités de Cinque Terre. Mais c'est un problème pour l'action d'aménagement et la vie quotidienne, le maintien de la population des viticulteurs, sachant que souvent les viticulteurs vendent leurs maisons ou vendent leurs cabanes dans les vignes pour les touristes. Hein, ils achètent à prix élevé, hein, évidemment, ça les intéresse. Et puis il y a ces risques fréquents de glissement de terrain avec des phénomènes de solifluxion. Et le 31 octobre 2011, il y a eu de nombreux morts, graves inondations. Hein, l'eau s'enfile sous les terres et puis d'un seul coup ça part comme ça et ça glisse vers le bas. Alors voilà, voilà un des villages de... Alors je ne sais plus exactement ce que c'est comme village, c'est pas Rio Maggiore, mais vous voyez la ligne de chemin de fer, hein, qui traverse et qui permet d'amener tous les touristes depuis la Spezia ou depuis le nord, depuis Gênes, etc. Alors les viticulteurs essayent de se dynamiser, etc. Ils ont installé ces espèces de petits funiculaires monorails pour pouvoir aller travailler leurs terres sur des pentes extrêmement raides. Je vous assure, c'est impressionnant. Hein, c'est vraiment très impressionnant. Hein, voilà les petits funiculaires monorails. Hein. Et je peux vous assurer que quand vous êtes dans une pente comme ça sur une de ces remorques, on se cramponne, hein, parce que... Hein. Voilà, alors avec des terrains d'expérimentation pour essayer de trouver d'autres types de cultures plutôt que de la vigne pour maintenir les terrasses. Bon, avec bien sûr des mobilisations, des viticulteurs, etc. Un autre exemple, c'est Tokai en Hongrie, où là l'enjeu est un peu différent. L'enjeu, c'était de récupérer la qualité du vin de Tokai, qui était, vous le savez peut-être, un des grands vins liquoreux d'Europe, qui était servi sur la table des rois. Hein. On trouve des allusions dans le baron de Munchausen, chez Voltaire, etc. Ce vignoble a été complètement transformé par les pratiques du système collectiviste soviétique, avec élargissement des rangées. On a fait descendre les vignes dans la plaine pour les irriguer, pour produire plus, etc. Évidemment, la qualité a disparu. En 89, après la chute du mur de Berlin, des investisseurs étrangers sont arrivés à Tokai, des Français, des Espagnols, et ils ont recolonisé les coteaux, hein, mais avec une confrontation avec les petits viticulteurs qui s'étaient maintenus. Et ça, c'est un véritable enjeu, hein, de l'avenir de ce vignoble. Hein, il faut trouver effectivement dans cette gestion un équilibre entre les grands domaines et les petits vignerons. Les grands domaines rassemblés dans l'association Tokai Renaissance, qui est une sorte de lobby, qui fait pression sur l'État pour faire passer des règles de qualité, alors que les petits vignerons ont moins de moyens. Hein, et donc pour essayer pour arriver au même niveau de qualité, ils ont plus de difficultés. Donc il y a ce conflit, cette tension. Et puis, il y a aussi le problème de l'érosion sur les sols de tubes volcaniques avec la confection de terrasses ou l'usage des mulches de paille, mais qui, évidemment, ne sont pas conformes à l'authenticité de Tokai. On n'a jamais fait ça auparavant. Hein, voilà les petites vignes, hein, voilà la fameuse bouteille de Tokai, hein, les caves des petits vignerons, voilà les grandes caves des grands domaines, hein, les grands domaines qui ont construit des grands chais ultra modernes, hein, avec des cuves en inox, etc., tout automatisé. Voilà les fameuses terrasses qu'on reconstruit aujourd'hui. Ça, c'est tout à fait récent, enfin récent, ça a une dizaine d'années. Hein. Et évidemment, c'est très différent du vignoble antérieur. Voilà. Alors, les volcans d'Auvergne, on parle quand même. Hein, bon, il se trouve que j'ai été le rapporteur du dossier pour le comité français le comité des biens français. Je connais un petit peu. On en a parlé déjà tout à l'heure. Je vais aller très vite, hein, mais je pense d'ailleurs, on va en reparler et on en parlera demain lors de la visite du circuit 1. Moi, il y a une chose qui m'intéresse, que je trouve extrêmement intéressante, c'est la question de la déprise agricole et de l'extension forestière, avec le risque de perte de lisibilité des cônes volcaniques et une gestion très difficile du foncier parce qu'il y a des individus, des sectionaux, des communaux, etc. Et c'est très compliqué pour arriver à gérer ça, mais il y a des expériences positives. Alors ça, c'est une photographie que j'ai prise en 1990. Ouais, bon, voilà. Alors on voyait encore assez bien les cônes volcaniques. Voilà une deuxième. Bon, les photos ne sont pas très bonne qualité parce qu'elles sont vieilles. Hein, et voilà ce que ça devient. C'est-à-dire que la forêt est en train de tout recouvrir. Hein, et petit à petit, les cônes s'effacent. Hein. Donc il y a cette question. Et puis aussi, bien sûr, il y a le maintien de l'activité de l'agriculture. Alors, bien sûr, dans toute cette question de la gestion, il y a le grand problème des dispositifs de gestion qui dépendent du contexte politique et social. Avec bien sûr la question de l'émergence du plan de gestion qui est maintenant obligatoire, avec bien sûr les questions, qui est-ce qui gère? Est-ce que c'est une institution, une collectivité locale ou régionale, un syndicat, une structure mixte? Quels sont les acteurs qui sont concernés? Quelles règles? Quels objectifs? Alors au Mont-Saint-Michel par exemple, il n'y avait pas de plan de gestion. Hein, il y a un syndicat mixte avec de nombreux problèmes, je passe très vite. Et donc on a essayé de promouvoir l'idée d'une nouvelle zone tampon qui se fondait sur l'ère de perception visuelle, avec des enjeux, bien sûr, de connaissance, de sauvegarde, de développement, de médiation, de gouvernance. Alors on s'est appuyé sur l'exemple du Val-de-Loire, de la mission Val-de-Loire, sur lequel on va revenir rapidement, qui a mis en place une conférence territoriale. Alors elle ne s'appelle pas paysagère dans le Val-de-Loire, je crois. Si. Non, elle s'appelle uniquement conférence territoriale, puisque la directrice de la mission Val-de-Loire est ici. Vous pourrez lui poser des questions si vous voulez avoir plus de détails. Donc une conférence territoriale coprésidée par le préfet du centre et le président, qui est président de la mission Val-de-Loire, avec une participation des conseils régionaux, généraux, les agglomérations, les communautés de communes, et placée sous l'autorité d'un représentant de l'État. Donc la gestion s'appuie sur la mission Val-de-Loire, qui est une structure d'ingénierie publique, portée juridiquement par un syndicat mixte interrégional avec les services de l'État. Et alors pour le Mont-Saint-Michel, on avait imaginé ça, mais c'est très difficile à faire passer, hein, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de conflits dans cette baie, et bon, les rôles qu'on voulait assigner à la conférence territoriale et paysagère, c'était ces rôles: valider l'aire d'influence paysagère, contribuer au partage des connaissances, examiner les questions relatives à la gestion du bien, proposer des mesures spécifiques, examiner les projets d'extension des périmètres protégés, notamment. Bon. Et en même temps, il nous semblait indispensable d'arriver à un projet territorial. Pas seulement gérer, mais aussi projeter, hein, un projet à l'échelle de la baie. Alors, je vais aller très vite maintenant, parce que je crois que je ne suis pas loin de la fin. Actuellement, au Mont-Saint-Michel, il y a simplement un projet technique. Je passe très très rapidement, hein, avec de nombreux conflits. Je vais vous montrer les images. Voilà, le projet, c'est supprimer la digue qui aboutit au Mont-Saint-Michel, faire une passerelle pour que les flux marins passent sous la passerelle pour pouvoir évacuer les sédiments. Hein. Donc vous voyez la passerelle en projet, voilà, avec un barrage qui fait chasse d'eau, donc qui emmagasine l'eau à marée haute, et quand on est à marée basse, on lâche l'eau et on chasse les sédiments. Hein. Voilà, alors ça c'est maintenant, voilà le barrage réalisé maintenant, et ici les travaux de la passerelle, vous voyez, c'est des travaux gigantesques. Hein. avec un futur petit train électrique qui va assurer le transfert des touristes vers le mont. Alors, le Val-de-Loire, bon, voilà, mais je pense que c'est un exemple intéressant, mais on pourra en reparler sans doute puisque l'équipe de la mission Val-de-Loire est présente ici. Il y a un comité des acteurs du Val-de-Loire, qui a un rôle consultatif, mais en même temps de réflexion et de proposition. La mission, qui est l'organe opérationnel, une équipe de 8 personnes. Un comité scientifique et technique. Un centre de ressources en construction. Et un plan de gestion qui a été adopté en 2012 avec une nouvelle forme de gouvernance du territoire. Alors, je vais juste évoquer très rapidement ce plan de gestion, voilà sa structure, la VUE, les menaces et les risques, les orientations pour une gestion partagée, les actions spécifiques de l'État. Voilà les orientations. Il y a 9 grandes orientations que je ne vais pas détailler. Alors voilà une, par exemple, maintenir les paysages ouverts du Val et les vues sur la Loire, avec un enjeu pour préserver les paysages pastoraux des bords de la Loire, soutenir l'activité pastorale, etc. Bon, alors donc, il y a des actions qui sont déjà mises en œuvre, comme par exemple la réglementation des boisements, parce que dans la vallée de la Loire, beaucoup de peupliers s'installent et masquent les vis-à-vis d'un bord à l'autre. Les orientations 3, c'est maintenir l'étalement urbain, je ne vais pas détailler, c'est introduire la dimension paysagère dans les plans d'urbanisme, les PLU, les SCOT, etc. Bon, avec ce qui a déjà été mis en œuvre, comme dans la charte du parc naturel régional Loire-Anjou-Touraine. Et puis d'autres exemples d'actions, comme par exemple les rendez-vous du Val-de-Loire, qui favorisent l'échange et l'expression des acteurs, qui mettent en exergue les initiatives, etc. Et puis les rencontres des médiateurs du patrimoine mondial, qui favorisent l'appropriation des valeurs de l'inscription et en prévision des actions expérimentales, comme une étude d'évaluation socio-économique du paysage et du patrimoine du Val-de-Loire, qu'on va lancer prochainement. Ça, c'est un autre exemple de configuration de dispositifs. Là, c'est les climats de Bourgogne qui ne sont pas encore candidats, mais ils ont déjà une structure extrêmement élaborée avec une association, une conférence territoriale, une commission technique permanente, des commissions thématiques, un conseil scientifique et une charte de territoire qui a été adoptée avec différents niveaux, aussi niveau citoyen, niveau politique, niveau opérationnel. Bon, avec, je ne détaille pas, le plan de gestion des climats de Bourgogne, je ne vais pas détailler, mais je voudrais terminer juste sur la question de la mise en œuvre de ces plans de gestion. D'abord, il y a le problème de l'efficacité des actions. Vous voyez qu'il y a très nombreuses actions qui sont envisagées. Alors, quelle efficacité, quelle force pour leur mise en œuvre? Quels sont les acteurs sur lesquels on va pouvoir s'appuyer pour la mise en œuvre? Et puis, le problème de l'évaluation de l'efficacité. Est-ce qu'on va pouvoir évaluer en retour l'efficacité? Leur continuité. Est-ce qu'on va pouvoir poursuivre dans le temps, alors que la question du temps est essentielle? Et puis, de l'évolution du contexte, de l'adaptation des actions au nouveau contexte et de la cohérence de l'ensemble. Gérer, oui, mais c'est aussi imaginer l'avenir. C'est-à-dire penser en termes de projet, c'est projeter. Et ça, je pense que c'est quelque chose qui peut-être encore a un peu du mal à se mettre en place. Donc un projet de paysage, c'est un processus qui se nourrit des connaissances qu'il produit lui-même, par boucle de rétroaction. On envisage des actions, ça produit une nouvelle connaissance, et on nourrit le projet avec ces nouvelles connaissances. Et évidemment, un projet ne peut pas se passer de l'ensemble des acteurs. On l'a vu avec beaucoup d'exemples, le bassin minier, les volcans d'Auvergne, les climats de Bourgogne, avec une forte mobilisation des acteurs, de leur participation à toutes les étapes du processus. Mais il y a aussi ce problème, et ça a été évoqué, je pense, tout à l'heure par vous-même, c'est la question du temps du débat. Ça, c'est extrêmement important, parce qu'il y a le temps du débat public, avec les acteurs, quels qu'ils soient, les habitants, etc. Et puis il y a le temps politique. Et le temps politique, il est rythmé par les élections. Et évidemment, il y a toujours une tension là, difficile. Et puis, bien sûr, il y a une méfiance du monde politique à l'égard de la participation. Parce que les élus, souvent, ont l'impression qu'on leur vole leur pouvoir, alors qu'il ne s'agit pas de ça. Il s'agit de prendre des décisions autrement. Donc, voilà, moi je pense qu'on ne peut pas se passer de l'idée d'un projet territorial, et là, il faut se poser la question, est-ce que la préservation de la VUE, c'est une stratégie qu'on peut mettre en place, ou est-ce qu'il faut passer de la préservation de la VUE à un projet d'aménagement du territoire, qui, bien sûr, l'intègre, mais qui va au-delà. Avoir une vision d'avenir partagée, et bien sûr, une mobilisation indispensable de tous les acteurs, avec... on peut très bien faire des projets à différentes échelles, faire des petits projets à l'intérieur d'un grand site qui vont servir d'exemple pour les autres. C'est ce qu'on avait envisagé pour la baie du Mont-Saint-Michel. C'était bien parti, le préfet était d'accord, et puis il a été muté. Ah, bon. Donc voilà, il faut tout recommencer. Hein, voyez. Il y a aussi ce problème-là de l'évolution des structures administratives. Donc moi je pense... Alors, on peut émettre beaucoup de critiques à l'égard de la gestion des sites du patrimoine mondial, mais je pense qu'ils ont un effet très bénéfique, c'est de servir d'exemple et d'expérimentation pour le reste du territoire. Ça, je crois que c'est extrêmement important. Je l'ai saisi petit à petit en regardant tous ces sites. Je me dis, voilà, à la limite, ce qu'on envisage de faire dans les sites du patrimoine mondial, on devrait le faire partout. Parce que, effectivement, ça permet d'innover. Et on voit bien ce que vous avez montré, Mme Brown, tout à l'heure, avec le projet Compact, on pourrait le faire ailleurs. Hein, tout à fait. Hein. Donc, c'est en prévision du bien-être des habitants, des populations. Et je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thanks. I'm Navraj Pradhan. I'm representing an organization called EC Mode, headquartered in Kathmandu, Nepal. My question is in reflection to Jessica, so just yours. I was very interested in compact strategy, looking at landscape approach and things like that. So we at EC Mode also look at transboundary landscape management and approaches in the whole Hindu-Kush Himalayan region. I was interested also that you said about the 5th C, that is the culture, community. We develop work on similar frameworks. We call it the 5 Cs. Community is the first thing, culture, conservation, commerce and development, and finally, external factors like climate change, which we need to address in landscape management. Okay, my question was, because you talked about modeling and how these, baseline assessments need to be addressed, because climate change is a factor that you need to sort of take into account when you talk about landscape approach and landscape management. Apart from modeling, whether there were, strategies of long-term monitoring stations, permanent sampling pots that were taken, that would be of interest to our strategy as well, because we are looking into this. And lastly, also, if Compact looks at strategies which develop transboundary landscapes, landscape approach is what we understand, not defined by administrative boundaries. We define it as ecosystem functions and boundaries. So whether it is that, coming from that perspective, I would be interested to know that. Thank you.
Compact model could, I think, be very relevant to the context in which you are working. Regarding transboundary cooperation, there are a couple of ways that I see this playing out, and again, I'm sure Julio will speak to it more this afternoon, but one is that there's a transboundary site, and that's the Juge Jiaoling World Biosphere Reserve and World Heritage Site, which spans the border of Mauritania and Senegal, and is actually it includes a Ramsar element and is very much a water site, actually, with a lot of issues, as we saw here also with Saint-Michel, related to water management. But the creation of the site certainly helped to start the transboundary cooperation, but I think my sense is that the decade of work with Compact has strengthened it even more, because it's brought in different levels. So it's not just the management and the transboundary cooperation at the level of 2 government agencies, but also civil society organizations, including very small CBOs, community-based organizations, which are collaborating on projects. So I think it does offer some useful lessons there. And another way where there isn't necessarily a transboundary site per se, but there's a transboundary system, I think would be in the case of where Julio's working in Sian Khan Biosphere Reserve and the Belize Barrier Reef System, which are obviously connected ecologically in many ways, but also culturally. In parts of the Belize Barrier Reef, you could be in Mexico. In other parts, you could be in Guatemala. You're really in Belize, and it's facing its own set of challenges with managing fisheries, the lobster fishery, and also there's some exciting things happening in both countries with livelihoods work. So there's been some very fruitful exchanges between the 2 programs, and Julio and his colleague have brought together lobster fishermen to see how each were using sustainable methods and also marketing their product as sustainably caught. Another with honey producers and so on. So there's a lot of potential there. Finally, to your point about climate change, I think, I realize now it was never even mentioned in the presentation. It's certainly the context in which Compact is working, and again, often that monitoring is happening more at the level of the site managers than the Compact organization, but they're doing a great deal in both adaptation activities and some interesting work with RED and carbon trading and so on. And also, they are working a bit in this area of community-based adaptation to climate change, so capturing the local knowledge related to adaptation.
Merci. Juste un petit commentaire sur l'intervention de Yves LUGINBUHL. Vous avez terminé par l'évocation très juste des enjeux du participatif. Et on ne peut qu'adhérer à ça comme enjeu dans la gestion des parcs du patrimoine mondial ou d'autres parcs ou d'autres situations. C'est un enjeu politique assez général. Pour autant, à mon avis, qu'on garde à l'esprit le fait que les jeux d'acteurs sont beaucoup plus compliqués et beaucoup plus hétérogènes que la juxtaposition, je dirais l'opposition, dans certains cas, entre une population locale et puis une sphère de décision politique. En fait, quand on va dans le détail de ces enjeux, en tout cas moi, ce que j'ai pu voir dans certains pays du Sud, dans la gestion des parcs naturels par exemple, on voit toute une sphère d'acteurs intermédiaires, les ONG, des consultants en marketing, en gestion participative, etc., qui compliquent énormément cette situation-là, dont il faut prendre en compte à la fois en termes de jeu d'acteurs, mais aussi en termes de conception du rapport aux politiques, et qu'on est loin, dans le cadre du participatif, d'avoir de ces idées de participatif, d'avoir un seul modèle unique qui serait la participation. Quand on rentre dans le détail, on a une grande quantité de modèles de participatif, dont certains aujourd'hui sont professionnalisés, c'est-à-dire que ça devient des entreprises. On a des acteurs qui sont des entreprises, des consultants participatifs qui en vivent et qui donc tendent à pérenniser leur activité, ce qui modifie les jeux politiques, mais sur des enjeux qui sont plus politiques, à ce moment-là, qui sont des enjeux commerciaux. Et du coup, vous avez terminé, je vais faire un petit pied de nez là-dessus, mais vous avez terminé en disant les politiques se méfient du participatif. Je dirais que la population aujourd'hui, dans certains cas, se méfie du participatif, justement à cause de cette tendance à l'ingénierie du politique qui modifie ce qui devrait être un lieu ou un espace d'expression citoyenne et qui est souvent un lieu de gestion administrative, d'un nouveau type de bureaucratie, qui est une bureaucratie souvent très étayée par l'informatique, etc., et puis une expertise, et puis qui est des enjeux commerciaux aussi d'ailleurs. Mais ceci dit, voilà, c'était juste pour commenter, c'était pas pour critiquer votre...
Non, mais j'avais pas trop le temps de développer, je suis tout à fait conscient de ces enjeux. Il y a de multiples expériences. Il se trouve qu'il y a C'était quand qu'on a fait le colloque, c'est en 2011 à Perpignan. On a fait un colloque où il y avait toute une partie sur la participation. Il y avait de très nombreux exemples qui venaient du monde entier. Du monde entier. Il y a une très grande diversité d'acteurs. Et c'est vrai que maintenant, on voit des opérateurs qui se spécialisent sur la question, qui deviennent vraiment des bureaux d'études spécialisés sur la participation. On pourrait citer quelques noms, mais bon, j'en connais. Et qu'il y a là un enjeu. Et il y a aussi, effectivement, de la part de la population, une méfiance. Une méfiance. Ah oui, on ne sait plus très trop bien à qui on s'adresse. Moi, je l'ai vu. Hein, bon, mais en même temps, on peut tirer de ces expériences des enseignements sur la gestion politique et sur la gouvernance. Hein. Alors, il se trouve que dans le Val-de-Loire, précisément, il y a une expérience en cours que je n'ai pas citée, hein, qui fait partie du programme de recherche paysage et le développement durable du ministère de l'écologie, que j'ai l'honneur de présider. Et elle est en cours, et là, elle va rentrer dans la phase d'atelier d'élaboration d'un projet sur une commune, qui est la commune de Villandry. Hein. Et pour l'instant, ça marche très bien. Ça marche, il y a une forte mobilisation. Alors, bien sûr, rien ne dit qu'ils vont arriver à quelque chose de parfait. Hein. Non, bien sûr. Mais je sais très bien quelles sont toutes ces difficultés des participations. On peut mettre un S. On peut mettre un S. Et il y a en décembre un colloque à Aix-en-Provence sur la question.
Just a word while he's taking the microphone is to say that the participation is a topic that we will develop, and especially during the session poster, you will see there are several posters presenting experiences, and we have the chance to have Mr. Bagilat, Mr. Tellus, who can give their opinion about that, because they are dealing with that every day.
Okay, thanks. This is a question for you, Jessica. It's very interesting to hear about all these different compact experiences. And I was wondering, so essentially showing that you can enhance some aspects of sustainability through different approaches, and you're promoting this model. Now, I want to ask to the sustainability of the sustainability model, so to speak. The project's ending, and what kind of signs are you seeing in terms of these kind of things being maintained, maybe challenges also in that respect, and experiences essentially in terms of both institutionally, financially, in terms of take up by national, all these kind of sustainability questions at large. What are you learning from the compact experience?
Right, it's a great question. It's a great question, and it's a big challenge. And I think it's interesting because this question always comes up when we give a fuller presentation. And again, you will see more about Compact from Julio in a case study, what they're actually doing. But everyone's like, this is great, and you're extending it, but how is it going to continue into the future? Now, the UNF grant was quite generous and was matched. I didn't show you all these figures, but $6 million and matched many times over by funding through SGP and other co-financing actors, including foundations. But ultimately, the grant finishes. And so how does it keep going? In one way, I think, again, and Julio can speak to this well, I think it's in some of the institutional cooperation mechanisms that are put in place at landscape level after a decade of really excellent and very participatory work. This is kind of scaling up beyond the biosphere reserve to the whole peninsula, and actors are working together as that example. In some other countries, also there are some networks that have been put in place, like a donors forum in Kenya, and the local consultative body, which is, I have a hard time with that one in English as well as in French, is one of the elements of governance of Compact. That often has continued even as the funding for Compact is starting to wind down. But it's a big question, and to your other point about how are these lessons learned being kind of taken up at national level, I think they are. Again, there's variability across the site, and one of the things I also didn't tell you is each of these programs, and they really are quite impressive on the ground, is managed by one coordinator, working with one local group and managing many, many different grants and taking time with projects. Julio works so closely with communities in a participatory way. Some of his colleagues do as well, and they don't have time to document it. Just putting together this book took a lot of time. It took the time of an outsider like myself as a consultant, because there isn't the time to capture that. And so I share that not only because with respect to Compact, but I think it's a very real challenge. Some of the very best work in participation that's happening on the ground isn't getting captured and shared because everybody's so busy doing that work and it takes so much time.